Well, thank you all for coming, and I've had one of my prefatory remarks has just been preempted because I was going to invite you all to join the History Center as well, because this is a really nice program and they've had a number of events, and if you're interested in events like this, let Marissa know. We'll carry on and do some more. Marissa Howard's been very helpful in getting everything set up, and because of the technology, it's easier for me just to sit here and you'll see the same thing I see on the screen. This lecture is kind of an old school. I'm old enough that I can claim to be old school. And what I mean by that is that, way back in the 19th, early 20th century, people wrote out extensive lectures. They formalized them. They made them exactly the kind of wording that they wanted. They were carefully constructed. And I'm often thought about Viollet-le-Duc, who was a medievalist, but was appointed as the historian of art at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And this was quite unusual because the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris is all focused on classical design. And when Viollet started lecturing on medieval architecture, all the students made such a ruckus, banging their feet on the floor and making so much noise that they couldn't hear Viollet. Literally got him to where they had to bring in the gendarme from Paris to cool the whole place down. And that's one method of indicating pleasure of a lecture in case that occurs tonight. But Viollet got his revenge because ultimately, because he was so carefully working in written lectures or lectures that were thought out more substantially, he decided that he would publish all his lectures. And we've been reading Viollet's lectures ever since. I mean, there's a Dover reprint in 2 volumes that are the lectures of Viollet-le-Duc. So it's an interesting dimension of a contemporary of John Ruskin. Tonight I'm going to be looking at this topic in 2 parts. The first is in England with respect to establishing the kind of background of what was considered a moral architecture, and also when you take a look at the Oxford Museum, which we will in a few minutes, an architecture which was didactic, which effectively meant that the buildings were intended to teach specifically ideas about what may be related to the subject or the purpose of the building. And there's another interesting side of this particular topic, which has had to do with Ruskin's influence, and particularly the architecture of William Butterfield, and that is this question of ugly architecture. And the adjective ugly was applied and may not have been totally pejorative, but nevertheless, it's interesting that it would have been used in any case at all. So you want to look for that in what is to follow. And then part 2 is about the United States and how this Ruskinian message, this message of John Ruskin about college buildings particularly, but was picked up by architects in the Ivy League schools, particularly Yale, Harvard, Cornell, but Northeast schools predominantly, and almost concentrated in the decade of the 1870s, which is interesting. And every once in a while I'll drop a few dates, and I know that's always difficult to do. You don't want to worry about dates, but nevertheless, you'll find it interesting that they all seem to coalesce in this decade of the 1870s. The 7 Lamps of Architecture, which was Ruskin's major, best-known work, was published in London by John Ruskin in 1849. It's a classic treatise on architectural aesthetics, arguing that design decisions were ethical judgments, and that building in the Gothic mode, as Ruskin prescribed, was virtually a moral duty. Construction materials were to be traditional and honestly employed. Color was natural and imperative. Arches were to be Gothic, that is, pointed and cuspate, and artisan craftsmanship was to be directly in evidence on legible sculpture and hand-wrought ornament. Ruskin sought nothing less than to guide architects and society at large toward an appreciation of and a continued creation of what he called good and great architecture. And contemporary 19th century architects should produce buildings that, as Ruskin advised, our descendants will thank us for. Well, for Ruskin, architecture was fundamentally an art. He wrote this in the opening pages of the Seven Lamps when he described architecture, in fact, defined architecture as that art which, taking up and admitting as conditions of its working the necessities and common uses of building, impresses on its form certain characters, venerable or beautiful, but otherwise unnecessary. It's a great definition of architecture. I used to tell my architecture students, if you ever see a sentence that starts, architecture is, pay attention and write it down, because to distill in one sentence a definition of architecture, I think, is very useful. Ironically, in referencing character as a quality beyond functionality and common building, Ruskin was echoing a central theme of the Beaux-Arts doctrine, emanating from the bastion of classicism, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The École promoted what they called in French caractère, which is character, as spiritual architectural values beyond the materialistic function and use. Ruskinian architecture, stylistically high Victorian Gothic, with its color, its ornament, its craftsmanship, and its Gothic power and delight, was full of character. A.W.N. Pugin had earlier declared Gothic to be the only true Christian architecture, so it was only natural that the style was adopted by mid-19th century architects for church buildings, and Oxford-inspired medieval revival collegiate architecture. The Oxford movement had prompted a shift toward conservative orthodoxy in theological circles, and the Cambridge Camden Society had advocated, indeed prescribed, design features for church architecture that would better accommodate the liturgy and ecclesiological requirements of the newly reclaimed traditional early church orthodoxy. The Camden Society's magazine, The Ecclesiologist, not only spelled out prescribed requirements for church building, but critiqued the church designs of contemporary architects like Cisco and Ebert. You got a 2 thumbs up or a 2 thumbs down. And for those church designs which were not approved, an architect would find it difficult to obtain additional commissions. William Butterfield emerged as a model architect for the Cambridge Camden Society when his All Saints Margaret Street in London was built beginning in 1850, immediately following the 1849 publication of Ruskin's Seven Lamps, and consecrated in 1859. As Charles Eastlake noted in his book entitled A History of the Gothic Revival, it had long been a project of the Camden Society, the Cambridge Camden Society, to fund a model church, or to found one, which would realize in its design and internal arrangements a beau ideal of beauty, of architectural beauty, and fulfill at the same time the requirements of Orthodox ritual. Alexander Beresford Hope, a founder of Trinity College in 1839 of the Cambridge Camden Society, advanced the idea of a model church, and both he and Stephen Glynn were appointed to supervise both the commissioning and construction of the church that became known as All Saints Margaret Street. Glynn was the son-in-law of Prime Minister William Gladstone, and a noted antiquarian and a student of historic British architecture, or church architecture in particular, said to have visited over 5,500 churches in England and Wales, recording his observations in a diary. He was considered an expert on medieval church architecture. However, when Glynn proved unable to take an active role in overseeing the All Saints Commission, Camden Society's Beresford Hope took sole charge. William Butterfield, for his part, produced a church considered not only the architect's masterpiece, but the progenitor of a new phase of Gothic revival architecture, dubbed High Victorian Gothic. Charles Eastlake's Gothic revival, published in 1872, 13 years after All Saints was consecrated, documents what has been called a subtle evolution of Gothic revivalism during this period. Few books, writes the American Life Foundation in the 1875 reprint of Eastlake's classic study, exemplify so well not only what a tremendous and basic shift was going on during the 1860s and 70s in fundamental concepts of what art and architecture are all about, but also how subtly, gradually, and unconsciously the shift proceeded, unquote. The impact at Butterfield's All Saints Margaret Street was indisputable. Looking back from the 21st century, Simon Jenkins considers All Saints to be architecturally England's most celebrated Victorian church. And Simon Thurley, the chief executive of English Heritage, named All Saints one of the 10 most important buildings in the country. As All Saints was being built, John Ruskin wrote The Stones of Venice. And this is what he said in The Stones of Venice. This church assuredly decides one question conclusively, that of our present capability of Gothic design. It is the first piece of architecture I have seen built in modern days which is free from all the signs of timidity and incapacity, in general proportion of parts, in refinement and piquancy of moldings, above all in force, vitality, and grace of floral ornament, worked in a broad and masculine manner. It challenges fearless comparison with the noblest work of any time. Having done this, we may do anything. We are able to do anything was the idea. There need be no limits to our hope or our confidence. And I believe it is to be possible for us not only to equal, but far to surpass in some respects any Gothic yet seen in the northern countries. That is one heck of an endorsement from John Ruskin to spell it out in that way. The red and black brickwork of the exterior of All Saints displays what became known as constructional polychrome that came to be associated with high Victorian Gothic and that spread to other churches and collegiate buildings later dubbed Ruskinian Gothic. In its inaugural appearance at All Saints, Butterfield's nonconformity offered an almost ruthless contrast with the thin, wiry, decorative linearity of earlier Commissioner Gothic, still clinging to an 18th century Georgian spirit and moving even to beyond the 14th century stone revivals of Pugin. The site on Margaret Street was small and inconvenient, introducing challenges that taxed the ingenuity of the young Butterfield, spurring the architect to break canonical design rules of architecture. Breaking rules was a practice that he enjoyed and continued with unabashed ferocity for the rest of his life, wrote John Summerson. The use of red brick itself was novel. The material was usually used for cheap churches, but the quality of the brick employed made it more expensive than stone in this case. And the patterns, no doubt, challenged the masons. The interior was thought to be too high for its width. There was no east window, and there was no window, or none at all, on the north aisles. That's a view across the nave toward the north wall. All these peculiarities were inevitably the result of this cramped site in the center of London. Butterfield joyfully accepted the curtailments, and however stunted the courtyard or the building forms of the interior space may be, he brought to the church what has been called a nobility of a saint in fetters. What dominated on both the exterior and the interior walls was this new colorism, seen first in the permanent polychrome, that is, the constructional coloration of the outside walls. The wags of the day referred to this as the streaky bacon style, a term first used to describe Butterfield's 1857 chapel at Balliol College at Oxford. In 1859, Building News documented that local critics said that Balliol's, quote, walls look like a slice of streaky bacon. Sir John Summerson called Butterfield's colorisms ugly. And in his book of essays entitled Heavenly Mansions, he introduces his analysis of the architect's work with a provocative first sentence. People of taste screw up their faces at the architecture of William Butterfield. Ugly, however, was not necessarily a pejorative word. Perhaps foreshadowing Robert Venturi, who praised the ugly and ordinary of commonplace landscape, Summerson saw Butterfield's ugliness as reactionary, a punch in the gut of 18th century Georgian taste, but also a catalyst for invention, for powerful form, for unorthodox color palette. Butterfield's means of escaping from taste, Summerson writes, was, quote, to drag the Gothic revival from its pedestal of scholarship and gentility and recreate it in the builder's yard, unquote. Well, like Frank Furness's buildings in this country, Butterfield's architecture was hard, muscular, fearless, contemptuous alike of the drawing room and the drawing board. Those who seek to understand the ruthlessness and inventiveness, the imagination here resides, quote, in something of the fauve. I don't know if you know what the early fauve movement is in early modern painting, but it's the painters that were using all kinds of wild, strong, strident colors in an unorthodox way. And the calculated assault on the sensuous qualities latent in the simplest of building forms. This is all from Summerson. These would be well served, I think, by reading Summerson's essay in Heavenly Mansions. The essay on William Butterfield is entitled William Butterfield, or the Glory of Ugliness, unquote. Great title for an essay. Well, as a model for high Victorian Gothic architecture, Butterfield's interior at All Saints is a celebration of color. There are striking patterns of floor tile, brickwork, decorative frescoes, and tile friezes, a painted ceiling, and a splendid pulpit. Along the north wall, dominating the interior, is a large ceramic tile frieze designed by Butterfield and painted by Alexander Gibbs, fired by Henry Poole and Sons, and installed in 1873. There's our decade, 1873. The frieze displays scenes from the Old Testament, representations of early church fathers, and in the central panel, a nativity scene. Nicholas Pevsner noted that no part of the walls of Butterfield's is left undecorated, and while the result is dazzling, it might also be considered ostentatious or obtrusive. From everywhere, Pevsner writes, the praise of the Lord is drummed into you. The interior, indeed, was a shock to observers unused to such a multiplicity of line patterns and ornament, excess, and the like, regretting, as Eastlake noted, that there simply was not a broad surface on which the eye can rest unoccupied. Indeed, despite his overall praise, Eastlake observed that there is evidence, even at All Saints, that the secret of knowing where to stop in decorative work had still to be acquired. But with all its contradictions, Butterfield's architecture was ultimately praiseworthy and influential. And it drew those closing observations from Charles Eastlake in his History of Gothic Revival. And this is what he finally concludes about Butterfield. Butterfield holds his own somewhat stern notions of architectural beauty, and he holds to them whether he is planning a cottage or a cathedral. In estimating the value of his skill, Eastlake concludes posterity may find something to smile at as eccentric, something to deplore as ill-judged, and much that will astonish as daring. But they will find nothing to despise as commonplace or mean, unquote. Well, polychrome was also evidenced in the work of George Edmund Street, whom I should mention briefly. His best-known work, St. James the Less, Westminster, is polychromed outside and in. Exterior walls of red brick are accented with black bricks, bands of Morpeth stone, polychrome voussoirs, and marble shafts. From inside, displays of red brick with black brick accents, yellow and red glazed tiles on lower walls, tile flooring, nave columns of granite, notched brick arcades, and capitals carved with the scenes of the parables and the miracles. Above the chancel arch is a Last Judgment fresco entitled The Doom, painted in 1861 by George Frederick Watts, a famous English painter. Street's masterpiece, where you may know his name, is the Law Courts in London. It was a winning design in an 1860s architectural competition and built in the 1870s and opened by Queen Victoria in 1882. Pevsner called the building a not undisciplined object lesson in free composition, and although symmetrical on its strand elevation, it remains enthusiastically Victorian in its varied turreted forms. But where's the polychrome, one might add? Well, it's there. It abounds on the Bell Yard elevation of this same building. It's one of the great masterpieces of Victorian architecture in London. Now, of equal influence as a catalyst for high Victorian Gothic or Ruskinian Gothic architecture was the museum, the University Museum at Oxford, one of the 19th century's in England most significant and influential work of didactic architecture. It was designed by Irish architects Dean and Woodward, mostly by Benjamin Woodward, and featured sculptural stone carvings by the brothers James and John O'Shea. Ruskin was looking on almost daily. Rather than red brick, the museum's exterior features stone with polychromed arched windows and may be considered an embodiment of Ruskin's definition of, quote, whether a given building be good Gothic or not, unquote. Well, he spelled out the recipe. The Nature of Gothic in the Stones of Venice, written a few years prior to the museum's construction. This is Ruskin's prescription. First, look if the roof rises to a steep gable high above the walls. Secondly, look if the principal windows and doors have pointed arches with gables over them. Thirdly, look if the arches are cusped or apertures foliated. Fourthly, look if its arches in general, whether of windows or doors or of minor ornamentation, are carried on true shafts with bases and capitals. If they are, then the building is assuredly of the finest Gothic style. Now that is probably the most explicit recipe in the history of architecture. Ruskin goes on to provide a further test to determine whether or not the building is good architecture. Was it built by strong men displaying a sort of roughness and largeness and nonchalance mixed in places with an exquisite tenderness suggestive of broad vision and massy power? Is it irregular, its different parts fitting themselves to different purposes? Are all the traceries, capitals, and other ornaments of perpetually varied design? And then lastly, read the sculpture, he says. And that we'll try to remember, read the sculpture. Coursework at Oxford, at the university, did not heretofore include degrees in the sciences. Oxford University primarily prepared theology students for careers as clergymen in the clergy. This changed when the University Museum, which provided not just lecture halls for physics, chemistry, biology, and geology, but a building whose very forms embodied references to these sciences. My use of the word didactic to describe the Oxford Museum is justified everywhere in this building. Chemistry was taught at the far end of the building, in this view, in a centralized ancillary building whose polygonal architectural form resembled medieval kitchens, such as at Fontevraud Abbey in France, or Oxford's actual model, which you can see, the 14th century octagonal abbot's kitchen, still extant at Glastonbury in Somerset. And this was a building that was surveyed and recorded by Augustus Pugin in the 1830s. The Oxford Chemistry Lab adapted the name Abbott's Kitchen. That's what they called the Chem Lab, metaphorically linking chemical formula to recipes and cuisine, and was one of the first purpose-built university chemical laboratories in the world. Principles of physics were embodied in the juxtaposition of traditional masonry construction with the open atrium of lightweight iron and glass construction inside. Indeed, the original structural iron atrium roof was found inadequate to support its own weight and was dismantled before it was completed, better accommodating the physics of the building by using stronger cast iron, not wrought iron, for spandrel arches as well as column supports, albeit maintaining wrought iron in the ornament. Let me show you the cast iron spandrels and the cast iron supports down below. And here are the tops of these capitals. These columns are cast iron, the capitals are wrought iron. And those capitals, by the way, are all botanical decorative tendrils illustrating tree species, including sycamores, walnuts, and palm trees. Surrounding the galleries these galleries appear almost like cloister walks, accented by arcades whose columns are enriched by carved capitals representing the flora and fauna of England. These were lessons in botany. So if you walk all around the whole atrium, every capital is a different floral species of the fauna and the like of Great Britain. And the shafts of the columns are made of different marbles and stones drawn from all over the British Isles. So effectively, it's a history of British geology. Every feature of the architectural form, structure, and ornament contributed to the building as a teaching instrument, as didactic architecture would mean. Here you can see a few of those details and looking across the atrium as well. So you get this wonderful juxtaposition of geology, capitals in botany, structural lessons in the cast iron beyond, etc. And then there were 19 statues of great men of sciences, which were carved, interestingly enough, by pre-Raphaelite artists, not sculptors, but actually painters, who then carved these sculptures and cited them all through the atrium. And they include Aristotle and Galileo, Isaac Newton, Linnaeus, and even Charles Darwin, who was added in 1899, but whose theories of evolution had been debated at Oxford earlier in the century. Especially noteworthy were the capitals and other decorative carvings by the O'Shea brothers, John and James, who weekly carried plants from Kew Gardens and from local nurseries to serve as models for the leafage of their delicate and botanically accurate capitals and window surrounds. Even Ruskin designed a window in 1858, executed by the O'Sheas, and reflecting what he described 5 years earlier in the Stones of Venice as the third and fourth order of windows, which he said would be represented in the Casa Sagredo in Venice. So he's got his historical model, he then designs a window, then the O'Shea brothers executed, and it's there at Oxford. Across the street from the Oxford Museum, William Butterfield built Keble College, which opened in 1870, with its noteworthy chapel and its distinctly Ruskinian polychromatic striations and streaky bacon surface enrichments. I suppose if people can be rude enough to call it streaky bacon, I can be rude enough to find an Argyle sweater that is the source of the same kind of patterns. It was originally a theological college and was dedicated to John Keble, who was a leader of the Oxford movement that, as mentioned earlier, promoted a return to liturgical orthodoxy and conservative theological practice, the Catholic nature of the Church of England. There was nothing reserved or conventional about the architecture of Keble, and it has received its share of criticism. By 1944, by which time modern architecture had advanced itself as colorless, abstract, and creations of functional space rather than aesthetic form, the social historian G.M. Trevelyan expressed the then commonly held view that, quote, the monstrosities of architecture erected by order of the dons of Oxford and Cambridge colleges in the days of William Butterfield give daily pain to posterity, unquote. Well, a dozen years earlier, Sir Kenneth Clark, I hope some of you know about Sir Kenneth Clark, way back in the 60s, he did that wonderful PBS series called Civilization. That if you haven't ever seen it, you ought to try to find it on Netflix if it's there. Anyway, Sir Kenneth Clark, as a very young man, as a young scholar, his very first book was called The Gothic Revival. It came out in 1928. And he described, which he described as an essay in the history of taste. That's what he called his subtitle of his book. Clark recalled that during his own Oxford days, it was universally believed that Ruskin had built Keble College. and that it was the ugliest building in the world. Undergraduates and young dons, Clark goes on to admit, used to break off on their afternoon walks in order to have a good laugh at the quadrangle. Well, in 1949, in response to the suggestion that the Gothic revival might be worth reprinting, Sir Kenneth Clark was beginning to realize that, quote, the greatest architects of the movement were precisely those whom my contemporaries thought most insufferable, Street and Butterfield. Well, times change. Throughout the third quarter of the 19th century, the influence of Butterfield and Street spawned a plethora of high Victorian Gothic churches, town halls, school buildings, and even residences were polychromed walls and pointed arches, as well as columns whose shafts differed in material from the capitals and the bases, all reflecting the precepts outlined in the Seven Lamps of Architecture. What were those precepts? Truth, beauty, power, memorable design, the lamp of memory, the lamp of power, the lamp of beauty, etc. Butterfield, among these Ruskinian architects, was considered especially ruthless as a Ruskinian, embodying in the relentless raw texture of his forms an aesthetic reflecting Ruskin's equation of savageness with Gothic, anti-classical to the extreme. Drawing his asymmetry and irregularity of form from the picturesque and his direct use of juxtaposition of common brick and stone from nature itself, Butterfield's aesthetic was both personal and idiosyncratic, indeed hypersensitive as well as influential. It does appear that Butterfield pulled out all the stops at Keble. The Liddon Quad is ablaze with colorful brickwork, chessboard gables, and tapestry wall surfaces. As I say, a veritable Argyle sweater display of patterned masonry. I think more recently Charles Jenks would call it an unintended metaphor. There are rows of chevrons, variegated brick ponds, and multicolored striations knitted into the building surfaces with an exuberance that critics not fond of Argyle might well indeed find ugly as an architectural dress. Kenneth Clark's classmates at Oxford certainly did. Butterfield intended Keble to be gay, but not all critics found it so. The architectural press proclaimed that his startling contrasting colors destroyed all breadth and repose. In the end, proclaimed his work to be the most approved holy zebra style. On the other hand, after a dozen years during which grime from Oxford chimneys would chill the warm, blazoned, hardening its stones to suit the austere high church reputation of the college itself, orthodoxy might be said to have been served by time. But as historian Paul Thompson notes, quote, there can be no doubt that the intention of the high Victorian revival of color was the very reverse of Puritan austerity. We would have every inch glowing, declared the Ecclesiologist magazine in 1845. Puritans would have every inch colorless. It may be the journal British Architect that offered the critique that best reflected the intention of the model architect of the Ecclesiologist in his revival of color as a high Victorian aesthetic. A correspondent described Butterfield's work in the British Architect, quote, the warmth and glow of the blazonry of colors illustrates the power of color to ennoble architecture, unquote. Well, Butterfield was clearly a taskmaster on the site, allowing masons little latitude in executing his vision of how building materials were to be handled. And as Paul Thompson has observed of Butterfield's supervision of masons on the site, he said, quote, when he visited the site, he had a sharp eye for the quality of their workmanship and would not hesitate to correct them. The brickwork is laid with admirable precision. The flint work glistens. The stone rubble walls show the exact texture he wanted. The roof is raked precisely as the specifications indicated. Butterfield rarely allowed any license on the building site. The Porter's Lodge off Parks Roads, which is right opposite the Oxford Museum, leads into this Lytton quadrangle, the largest quadrangle at Keble, with a chapel, which you can see in this view now at the far north end, opposite the library on the south side. Butterfield's chapel at Keble was opened 20 years after his All Saints Margaret Street in London, and it demonstrates that Butterfield's passion for color had little abated. Its elevation embodies Ruskin's advice to design and construct in broad strokes in the lower sections of the wall, and to gain in elaboration and delicacy as one moves higher up the wall. Ruskin wrote in the Stones of Venice, quote, "In general, the base of a wall, which in the beginning of its labor will bear least decoration, its body, more especially those epochs of rest called string courses, but its crown or cornice most of all. This heightening of texture is noticeable on the broad north quad elevation of Keble College, or Keble Chapel. Inside, the chapel discloses its design debt to the 13th century upper church of the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi in Italy, a single nave space with no aisles and famous for its frescoes of Giotto. I don't know if any of you have been to Assisi to see the Giotto frescoes in the Assisi upper church, but that's the interior on the right, and it inspired Butterfield. In addition to spatial similarities, the Keble Chapel recalls Assisi's patterned flooring, its transverse and quadripartite vaulting, its compartmentalized display of wall art, both below and flanking upper windows. Along Keble's interior chapel lower walls is a display of blind arcades of rich assortment of marbles layered with brick and ornamental tile banding behind. Above are Butterfield's mosaics, said by Pevsner to be the work of Butterfield's favorite stained glass designer, Alexander Gibbs. These mosaics present to the viewer a continuous flow of framed panels of Old Testament themes of salvation and sacrifice, stories of Noah, Joseph, Abraham, and Moses, with their New Testament associations of prophecy and fulfillment. The mosaic panels are aligned to lead the eyes to the altar, where the celebration of the communion commemorates the ultimate sacrifice in the Christian faith. In one mosaic panel, the theme is represented as representing the depiction of Moses and the brazen serpent, foreshadowing Christ's crucifixion and the salvation of man. Similarly, in another mosaic, Noah saves the peoples of the world, with the ark appearing as a church on a hill, top right of that view, the scene symbolic of salvation from the flood as it foretells man's salvation through Christ. Elsewhere, when Joseph is sold into slavery, his brothers receive a sack of gold, foreshadowing Judas's betrayal of Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. In another mosaic, Joseph is raised from the prison tomb that he shares with robbers and murderers, a subject foreshadowing Jesus' resurrection. The later subject is depicted in a mosaic showing 4 soldiers below and the risen Christ surmounted by an almond-shaped mandorla, a frequent backdrop in carved and painted figures of Jesus in churches throughout Christendom. As the Reverend George Westaver has explained in his essay, Reading the Bible Through Keble's Mosaics, these themes of salvation are visual reminders through the art of the celebration of the Eucharist, the ceremony of Holy Communion, symbolic of the bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ at the Last Supper prior to his crucifixion. The prominence of these themes of sacrifice and salvation in the chapel of the college named for John Keble, a leader of the Oxford Museum movement, is further reflected by the fact that the choir at Keble, where the Eucharist is celebrated, takes up almost half the interior space of the chapel. The mosaics above the reredos was controversial, inasmuch as Orthodox clergymen wanted a traditional crucifixion, whereas Butterfield insisted on the enthroned figure as installed, the Son of Man from Revelation, depicted with the sharp two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Butterfield argued that the crucifixion represented death in the past, whereas John's vision of the church united, as set forth in the book of Revelation, conveyed the promise of both the unity of churches as well as the second coming of Christ, both the present and the future. As Butterfield revealed to Huck Gibbs, a major donor to Keble College, I believe our Lord is in the midst of his church as he promised. The more we see that the church divided and at variance in Christendom, so much the more it is necessary to go back to St. John's vision of her at unity and with our Lord in the midst. So Butterfield's East mosaic and the Revelation was installed in the place of primacy above the reredos on the east wall of the choir. Opposite is Butterfield's West mosaic under the great west window, representing the Last Judgment, a traditional theme and treatment. Christ is enthroned and flanked by angels with 12 disciples gathered around, with the traditional depiction below of the archangel Michael weighing the souls, and the saved in the left panel, that is the right hand of God, hopefully and then cheerfully represented as the elect, although not yet connoting predestination, while the agitated figures on the right panel, they're not at all happy on the right panel, are damned and shown in distress at the fiery gates of hell. Above and below and everywhere and behind the mosaics, the architecture of the interior chapel complements and intensifies the colorism of the art. Brick and tile in varied patterns repeat the polychrome of the chapel's exterior and the whole of Keble College. Foliate friezes and column capitals are richly carved, the latter enriched with gilt. Column shafts echo the linearity of the early English Gothic. Usage of contrasting polished gray Purbeck marble and rows of white tile are accented with abstract floral motifs, cuspate arch profiles, and aligned quatrefoils. It is all typical and robust Butterfield, light and gay to some, while overdone and busy to others. Stained glass, of course, had traditionally brought color and narrative Bible stories into the medieval church, and Butterfield's favorite stained glass artist, Alexander Gibbs, provided figure and storied windows at Keble to enrich the chapel even further. The east window, with its geometric decorated tracery, is rich in reds and blues. These are the colors that dominated in the 12th and the 13th century, then accented with yellows and greens, which were dominant in the 14th century glass and later, and noticeably successful in handling pastel backgrounds in contrast with the richer purple and burgundy robes. In all, it fully covered the color wheel of the high Victorian colorism. It represented Christ in majesty, and most likely an ascension scene with Mary and St. Peter in the light below, flanked either side by 10 of the other disciples, Judas not in evidence. Among the disciples are two beardless figures. St. John, whose youth at the time of the Last Supper promotes his depiction typically through the history of art as a young man without a beard. Usually if you see a whole group of the Last Supper or whatever it is, and there's one guy that doesn't have a beard, that's John. And St. Thomas, who sometimes is also beardless because he was thought to be a youth because he doubted everything and really had to be shown, youths that are like that, I guess, that, shown the wound, etc., that Christ had in fact risen. And opposite this east window is the large west window above the wall mosaic of the Last Judgment. Below the cuspate tracery and pointed arches are 2 rows of 8 seated figures of the Old Testament. In the top row, King Solomon holds its temple containing the Ark of the Covenant. At his right, which is the left as you're viewing this, is the prophet Samuel holding a vessel, perhaps the one in which he anointed David king of Israel. On the other side, Elijah is holding a bird with fiery red and yellow wings, a symbol perhaps of the prophet's ascension into heaven by a fiery chariot. On the other hand, the bird appears to be offering Elijah a wafer, manna from heaven perhaps, and quite likely inspired by fragments of the Tuscan altarpiece in the Christ Church Picture Gallery at Oxford. All of that is all filled with symbolism. In the lower row, the Old Testament figures are left to right: Isaiah, Jeremiah, David, he's the one crowned and holding a scepter and a musical instrument, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Colors are striking and varied, and the dialogue between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the west and east windows contributes to Butterfield's theme of unity of the church now and forever. And there's always, and a lot of time in church design and stained glass or mosaic or whatever, this notion that the Old Testament is the prophecy and the New Testament is the fulfillment, and those stories are often related. In the end, Keble College Chapel is a symphony of color, combining strident tones of juxtaposed materials with the continuous rhythm and pace of historiated mosaics of Old and New Testament themes. The focus, as Butterfield wanted it, is on the East quatrefoil representation of Christ's second coming as proclaimed in the book of Revelation. Despite the misinformed view that Ruskin had designed Keble, there is merit to the generalized conclusion that the design of the college and chapel do reflect Ruskin's views concerning natural color, honest materials, the nature of Gothic, and the moral underpinning of good and great architecture. Now, I've gone to this extent to give an English background because Ruskin is English, he's being read by the English, he's being manifested in works like Butterfield's career, etc. But now we shift to the United States. Beyond Ruskin's influence on English churches and schools, the impact of his aesthetic ideas, stylistically high Victorian Gothic with its color and ornament, craftsmanship, and Gothic power and delight, this was also substantial in the American scene. Vincent Scully, major historian at Yale, has noted that the writings of John Ruskin were, quote, basic reading for all architects in America during the 1870s, and were rarely mentioned with less than profound respect. Ruskin's Seven Lamps of Architecture, published in London, as I mentioned, in 1849, appeared in an unauthorized edition in New York that same year and went through 25 editions by 1894. Similarly, his Stones of Venice appeared in America in 24 editions between 1851 and 1894. These two books were all over the late 19th century. Scully observed, quote, principles of truth and reality based upon a new aesthetic morality and spiced by Ruskin's peculiarly picturesque vision may therefore be truly said to have formed the basic approach to architecture of a vast body of the reading public throughout the third quarter of the 19th century and for some time afterwards. So it became of interest to me to kind of trace and look at what that influence might be, certainly in the intellectual climate of Ivy League colleges. Nowhere in America was this Ruskinian spirit more in evidence than in the forms, materials, ornament, and color of collegiate architecture during the period on northeastern university campuses. An early example of Ruskinian Gothic is the Knott Memorial Hall by Edward Tuckerman Potter, whose construction as alumni hall at Union College in Schenectady, New York, began in 1858 and was not completed until 1879. So this was under construction during our decade, thus spanning that period of Ruskin's major influence. The original 1813 campus plan for Union College, which I think is interesting, you see that on the right, is by Joseph Jacques Ramey, and it called for a rotunda flanked by neoclassical classroom structures and wings extending either side of a campus green. In other words, it could well have influenced Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia, which is essentially a rotunda with the classrooms and dorms along the side. Union College ultimately sited its memorial in the center of that green, and it took the form of a medieval baptistry or a mausoleum. The building was 16-sided, centralized under a pointed dome, and by its mid-19th century date was influenced by Ruskin in its polychrome, its cuspate arches, its variegated roof tiles on a ribbed dome, and columns with contrasting materials for shafts and capitals. It served almost 60 years as a library. Then from 1904, and this was the centennial of the beginning of Knott's presidency, Eliphalet Knott was the first president of Union College, who was president from 1804 to 1866, so it became a memorial to him. Briefly from 1961 to the building's 1993 restoration, a bookstore occupied the basement and a theater in the round was above. But since 1995, the memorial has doubled as a campus art gallery. It's had these multiple functions, a period of time when it was the library. After the Civil War, the college construction was renewed in Northeast Ivy League schools and fell under Ruskin's influence. From 1869 to 1870, Yale University built Farnham Hall, top left. In 1870, Harvard began Memorial Hall, top right. In 1871, Princeton erected the Chancellor Green Library, bottom left, and between 1871 and 1875, Cornell built 3 of its 4 Ruskin-inspired buildings: the President's House, Sage College, and Sage Chapel. Each of these, to varying degrees, gives evidence of an intellectual climate, an aesthetic interest, a receptivity of the university clients to Ruskin, to his ideals of character and truth in an architecture that called for natural materials, color, noble, honest, and beautiful architecture, and, if you look at the capitals, sermons in stone. Farnham Hall, designed by Russell Sturgis, is Yale's oldest dormitory still in use. It was built in 1869 to 70. The Sturgis building translates the Oxford Museum elevation to red brick, accented by contrasting stone string courses, large pointed windows, and smaller windows whose stone lintels form cuspate openings. Gabled dormers top each bay, and the entries are crowned with Venetian Gothic-inspired recessed stone tympana, and are flanked by paired columns whose shafts contrast in material with the carved capitals and bases. In other words, the Oxford Museum is all over this building. Sturgis followed this Yale building with another dormitory, Durfee Hall, 1871, with polychromed arches across the facade of predominantly split-faced New Jersey sandstone. And 3 years later, he built the Battle Chapel, 74 to 6. Farnham's red brick, however, projects the most Ruskinian aesthetic as predominated in American buildings during that decade. Princeton's neo-Gothic buildings, composed as quadrangles enclosing greens, reflected a tendency among especially Ivy League American colleges to project themselves as the American equivalents of Oxford and Cambridge, whose quadrangles with porters' lodges, chapels, libraries, and dining halls were considered model campuses of the highest learning. However, when William Porter in 1873 built the Chancellor Green Library and completed it at Princeton, it stood out because of both its high Victorian styling and its rotunda form. There are notable precedences for centralized library buildings, some with a like radial arrangement of book stacks. One could cite in the bottom left James Gibbs's Radcliffe Camera at Oxford, which of course is classical and also 18th century, but is a circular library building, or Jefferson's classical rotunda at the University of Virginia, or Sidney Smirke, I love that name, Smirke for an architect, his circular reading room at the British Museum on the right screen. And of course that's Union College's, Princeton's interior dome on the left top. But these buildings were dressed in classical forms, and the Knott Memorial at Union College, although polygonal and high Victorian Gothic, can't be considered a precedent for the Princeton building because it wasn't converted to a library until the early 20th century. But contemporary with Potter's Princeton Library is perhaps a known precedent, was the high Victorian Gothic library at the Houses of Parliament in Ottawa, begun in 1859 but not completed until the middle of the 70s. This is our famous decade. It was conceived in the form of a buttressed centralized chapter house. The Ottawa Library, as well as Princeton's, featured cuspate arches and polychrome characteristic of Ruskin's inspired Gothic. But probably the best known of all of these, and the highest of the high Victorian, is Harvard's Memorial Hall. It's built literally through the decade, 1870 to 1877, by Ware and Van Brunt. The firm of William Robert Ware and Henry Van Brunt was established in 1864, and the following year, Ware became the first professor of architecture at MIT. At the end of the 1870s, the decade of strong Ruskinian influence, Ware and Van Brunt dissolved their partnership in 1881, and Ware founded a second architectural school, that at Columbia University in New York. Well, the masterpiece of the partnership, of the Ware and Van Brunt partnership, was Memorial Hall at Harvard, a high Victorian Gothic work whose cathedral form contained three separate functions in the nave, the transepts, and the apse. In the apsidal east end, with its sort of radiating eastern section, is the Sanders Theater, intended for academic ceremonies. It was inspired by Christopher Wren's Sheldonian Theater in Oxford, but the Sanders Theater, seating 1,000 for lectures, concerts, and ceremonial ceremonies and different conferences, has had this continued use as a theater ever since. The transept arms, which served as a vestibule for the theater, comprise a dimly lit gallery featuring 60-foot high Gothic vaults, that's 2 feet less than Wells Cathedral in England, marble floor, a black walnut panel and paneling and stencil walls. This is known as memorial transept because it's a central space of Memorial Hall, consecrated to memorialize 136 Harvard men who died in the Civil War fighting for the Union. And finally, the great nave is a vast refectory inspired by Westminster Hall in London and known as Alumni Hall or the Great Hall. It's now called Annenberg Hall. Although intended originally for formal occasions such as alumni dinners, it soon became a dining commons for students who in 1884 paid the exorbitant price of $3.97 a month for meals. Well, the exterior displayed all the signposts of Ruskinian High Victorian design. Power, displayed in monumental gabled and towered forms. Truth and beauty, evidenced in the polychrome and the voussoirs. Multicolored roof tiles, red and black brickwork with limestone accents, all that beauty. Craftsmanship in the carved capitals, cuspate arches, and intricate masonry. The tower was altered in 1897 to include 4 clocks, creating a form that architectural historian Kenneth John Conant called Railroad Gothic. I think he had St. Patrick's Railroad Station in mind in London. The tower was destroyed by fire in 1856, and in 2000, the original 1878 tower was reinstated. When I was at Cornell as a graduate student, I would go down and see this building, and it looked, not with the smoke coming out of it, but it looked pretty much like you see in the bottom, well, in these photographs without the tower. But since that time, the original tower has been restored. And we finally, and there you can see it in its original restoration, we finally come to Cornell, where 3 Ruskinian Gothic buildings were erected in the same decade, the 1870s, and a 4th the following decade. Cornell was founded as a land grant university under the Morrill Act of 1862, and it was privately endowed by Ezra Cornell, a founder of the Western Union Telegraph Company. Andrew Dixon White became the college's first president. From 1866 to 1885 he served, and helped shape the architecture of the early years of the university. However, the first buildings at Cornell were less admired by White. They were mansard-roofed stone structures of rough-cut Ithaca ashlar, trimmed in cut limestone coins and sited to enclose an intended stone quadrangle. They include Morrill Hall, 1866, and its duplicate White Hall, 1867, these by Wilcox and Porter, and McGraw Hall and West Sibley Hall by Archimedes Russell. But Andrew Dixon White found them lacking in ways he later articulated at the time he resigned as president, when he was calling for Cornell to adopt a general campus plan enriched by what he called sermons in stone, and reflecting these other buildings that he had influenced during his presidency. In this 1885 annual report, the president warned the trustees that if the campus was, quote, hard, dry, and unattractive, its buildings mere boxes, its grounds a mere plot of earth for such boxes to stand on, then the university would, quote, fail in one of the highest parts of its mission. Arguing that there was an educational value in creating an atmosphere that would make students something more than machines, White encouraged Cornell to, quote, enrich itself with buildings that quicken the sense of beauty, in memorials which arouse love and veneration, in works of art that stimulate manliness, and in general development of the treasuries of beauty lying all about, unquote. He was invoking Ruskin's lamps of beauty, memory, and power, and had already provided the models. During the preceding decade, President White had presided over the construction of 3 buildings about which Cornell campus historian Kermit Parsons has written in the chapter called Mr. Ruskin Would Be Pleased. I love that chapter title. The first was White's own President's House, whose preliminary plan by George Haythorne, based on a picturesque villa design in Calvert Vaux's 1865 pattern book, Villages and Cottages, was revised by White's protege, student architect at Cornell, William Henry Miller, with further revisions and superintending work by Charles Babcock. And these figures, Charles Babcock especially, are involved in these Ruskinian buildings. Babcock was a former partner and son-in-law of the Gothic revivalist Richard Upjohn, and he was the first professor at Cornell in architecture. A south wing designed by William Miller, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, was added to White's 1871 residence as late as 1911, but the principal house, which is on the left part of the screen, is what was done under White's presidency. 2 features are especially noteworthy in the context of this discussion of Ruskin's influence on architecture in the 1870s. Flanking the front entrance of the President's House are stone corbels and capitals carved by English sculptor Robert Richardson, his first work in Ithaca. On the left side, they depict birds, butterflies, flowers, and good fruits, that's figs and grapes. And on the right are the evil fruits, poison ivy and deadly nightshade, with rock demons such as newts and lizards, as though good and evil were being represented left and right, much as medieval carvers depicted the elect and the damned at the entrance to medieval churches. Art and architecture have a moral purpose, Ruskin preached, and White believed, and so at the entry to the President's House, he also had carved the inscription, "Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?" Read the sculpture, Ruskin had advised in the Stones of Venice. Hovering over the entry is a dramatically projecting balcony whose weighty substance, like a seaside cliff undercut by the action of wind and tidal waves, embodies qualities that Ruskin described in the 7 Lamps, the power of nature, the expressive power and authority of architecture. I am much inclined myself, Ruskin wrote in the Lamp of Power, to love the true vertical, or the vertical with a solemn frown of projection. This character is always given to rocks by the poets, with slight foundation, indeed real rocks being little over to overhanging, but with the excellent judgment for the sense of threatening conveyed by this form is a noble character than that of mere size. Both the overhanging balcony at the White residence and the high tower and projecting oriel bay over the entrance to Sage College project this impression of power at Cornell, conveying a visual reminder of presidential power. And in fact, it does continue into modern times if you look at where the mayor's office is over the entrance of Boston City Hall in the brutalist aesthetic. Similar projecting overhang to convey power. Ruskin considered that standing beneath such an overhang in nature, an individual experiences the majesty of what the 18th century called the sublime, understood as greatness, whether physical, moral, intellectual, metaphysical, aesthetic, or spiritual. The stone balcony floor at the president's house weighed 2 tons, and the balcony itself had balustrades with 20 stone pillars, no 2 of them carved similarly. White made a practice of addressing from this presidential balcony teams of athletes returning to Ithaca victorious from sports competitions, and he ceremoniously greeted visiting students and others from here. The authority of the college presidency was here embodied in a masonry house that President White occupied during his presidency, but which he planned to leave for future presidents. During his many years affiliated with Cornell, White placed around the campus grounds sculpture, benches, fountains, memorial plaques, bells, paintings, stained glass, quote, to remind students of men's accomplishments in the past. His legacy was also notably architectural. Dissatisfied with the direction of the earliest boxy buildings being constructed around Cornell's stone quadrangle, with the practical builders, as he called them, where they prevailed, President White envisioned a picturesque campus architecture embodied with the values that Ruskin had praised: beauty, truth, sacrifice, memorial form, and moral values. So during the early 1870s, he stewarded the design and construction of 2 of the finest Ruskin-inspired buildings in America, Cornell's Sage College and Sage Chapel. Cornell was opened in 1868 exclusively for men, and while both White and Ezra Cornell himself favored coeducation, White thought the university should be firmly established before introducing female students. 3 years later, one of the university trustees, Henry Sage, offered to build and endow a college for women. Beyond his own willingness to admit women, White saw the opportunity for a shift away from those boxes to a Ruskinian Gothic designed campus for the women. To ensure the selection of an architect who would design in the style he preferred, White agreed to donate part of his extensive architectural library to the university on the condition the university established a school of architecture. The campus historian observed that after 1870, White played an increasing role in decisions on campus architecture, and it was soon apparent that the architect selected for the chair in architecture would also be the designer of the new Sage College building, Charles Babcock. The architect was also a churchman, having retired from active architectural practice to enter the Episcopal ministry in 1858, but he accepted the chair in architecture. He was brought back to Cornell as an architect in September of 1871, and he began immediately preparing designs and drawings for Sage College to be sited outside the original quadrangle. The cornerstone of Sage was laid in 1873, and Andrew Dixon White praised the architect for providing a building, quote, admirably suited to the founder's noble purposes. It combines to make healthful and cheerful students at home. There's an interior parlor in the house, in the building, but comfort and bare utility have not been the only thing that he thought of, says White. As a believer in the possibility of sermons in stone, he continues, quote, I rejoice to see that in and about this building there is a great deal of crystallized eloquence, very forcible, though very quiet, and moreover perpetual. In acknowledging the role of the craftsman, White praised the work that has come from the hands and brains and heart of our stone carvers. He praised 2 sculptural capitals with all their crisp leaves and rich fruits and flowers, which are to stand among the multitude of others no less exquisite in workmanship, and to testify to you that while utility and comfort are provided for, there is also an administering into the sense of beauty. Finally, White praised the workmen as skilled in the best practice and training in the best of the art schools. Their sculptures have been done with love, and years after we have passed away, they will be looked upon with gratitude. Sage College rightfully has been compared to the University Museum at Oxford, translating its stone exterior to red brick, but quoting Oxford's central tower, its gabled dormers, they're on mansard roofs at Cornell, the polygonal side stair tower, which you can see on the far right, top and bottom, with a high candle snuffer roof, and an entry arch and pointed window openings accented with polychromatic voussoirs expressive of the radiating nature of architecture and the arch. Less exuberant than Butterfield's black and white brick banding and streaky bacon striations, the horizontal bands of color-contrasted brick and sage are restrained, but acknowledge Ruskin's belief that such is the only correct way to deal with a flat wall surface. Sage features bands of molded yellow and black brick, stone trim contrasting with red brick and colored coins. The columns are true shafts with different materials for the capitals, and the capitals are carved as natural leafage and polished marble shaft, Ruskinian beauty and truth. And the projecting corbelled wood bay above the entry and the projecting forward from the looming tower are Ruskin's statements of architectural power. Parsons sees the central tower as virtually alive and somewhat menacing, appearing ready to fall on the approaching visitor as one mounts the steps of the terrace. Well, I'm not sure I would say that, but maybe. Finally, and we are getting to the end here, let's see if I can get back to there, the last building, the third Ruskinian landmark of the 1870s at Cornell is Sage Chapel, designed also by that first professor of architecture in 1872, Charles Babcock. It was originally an L plan with a nave and side aisles and a 75-foot tower with a belfry and spire, but the non-denominational chapel, for which Babcock served as preacher as well, opened in 1875, but has been altered several times since. Excuse me, I'm hitting the wrong side here. There we go. A memorial antechapel was added on the north side in 1882 to serve as a final resting place for important members of the Cornell community. Today, there are 14 individuals, including the founder, Ezra Cornell, who you can see at the sarcophagus at the far end of this space, and Andrew Dixon White and their wives. In 1898, on east end, the chapel apse was added to accommodate tombs for the donors, Henry Sage and his wife. A north transept dates to 1903, and finally in 1940 to 41, a west wing expansion and renovation added more space to accommodate a new choir loft and an organ. The west rose was preserved by simply moving the west wall 40 feet to accommodate the additional space. And the original hammer beam trusses were preserved that spanned the original building. The chapel was built of red brick with stone trim. Windows were capped with polychromed voussoirs and tracery and geometric decorated design, including additional rose windows at the gable ends. Corners were buttressed, high gables were steep. A spacious interior under intersecting gables features a complex wood truss, richly decorated and colorful. All that is pure Ruskin. Inside, the original nave was spanned by this hammer beam truss and was chaste and calm compared to today's chapel with its elaborate ceiling decorations, which were added 3 decades later. Like a medieval master mason overseeing the long building campaigns of a Gothic cathedral, Charles Babcock lived with this chapel because he was involved with all the additions as well, or most of them, except the very last one. Because of this continuity of design, Cornell's campus historian observes that the resulting structure has unity as well as a great deal of picturesque variety. And it is really extraordinary on the inside. There is a 42-foot wide, 7-foot high mosaic entitled The Realm of Learning, designed by Ellie Lamb, who was the wife of Charles Lamb, who supervised the chapel decoration. The Lamb Studios in Philadelphia were stained glass experts, and this was executed by J&R Lamb. The mosaic was installed in a semi-octagonal apse space. Life-size figures symbolize the work of the university, with the young man and young woman at the far end of this long piece. The Library of Congress on the bottom has preserved the original study sketch for the mosaic procession. In between the coeducational figures, the man and the boy and the girl at the far end, are 8 figures representing the sciences: biology, astronomy, and physics on one side, literature, architecture, and music on the other. The arts stand next to a figure representing truth and another figure representing sciences. And at the very center is the mosaic is a canopied throne with philosophy centralized, symbolizing the unity of all learning and an allegorical unification of dualities, male and female, beauty and truth, science and the arts. The colorful ceiling ornamentation was designed and executed by Cotier of New York as part of the 1903-4 enlargement of the chapel, in which Charles Babcock was still on hand as the architect. The ceiling was similarly full of symbolism. The ceiling has meaning in terms of linking the colors to heavenly sky blue of the cross truss, accented with gilded sunburst stars and Christian symbols. The meanings associated with each color have been summarized, citing a description written in 1904. White stands for innocence, purity, faith, joy, and life. Red for fire, heat, creative power, and divine love. Gray for mourning, grieving, humility, and innocence accused. Blue for heaven and truth. Green for immortality. Gold for the sun and the goodness of God. Goldwin Smith, who was the professor of history at Oxford and later at Cornell, considered the Sage College and the Sage Chapel quite equal in merit to the modern Gothic of Oxford, that is, to Keble College and the chapel by Butterfield. Acknowledging that Professor Smith's Oxford connection lent him some qualifications as an expert in collegiate Gothic, critic Architectural Schuyler concluded that Smith's assessment was an understatement. Evaluating Sage Chapel in its present condition, that is, after the colorful interior ornament was added, this primary American architectural writer pronounced the Sage buildings, the college and the chapel, superior to Keble College. The sprightliness and animation of form and color at Keble acted to destroy repose, and the polychromatic surfaces of Keble, especially inside, were very trying, Schuyler lamented. So he actually preferred Cornell. Finally, Sage College and Sage Chapel were part of an informally designed South Campus, contrasted with the formality of the original, what's now called the Fine Arts Quadrangle at Cornell. Compatible brick buildings such as the old Armory were designed by Babcock in 1883, but that's been razed. That's the top right corner. Barnes Hall is still there. It's from 1887 and served for a while as part of the bookstore. When these buildings first arose with their natural landscape, this was, quote, one of the loveliest parts of the Cornell campus. Campus historians concluded that is until university growth all but filled this area with buildings. One postscript is noted. Cornell's alma mater song, Far Above Cayuga's Waters, was written in our decade of the 1870s when Ruskin was prevailing in the sympathy of the school, by two individuals from the classes of 1872 and 1874 who were matriculating at Cornell at the very moment that Sage buildings were being built. The words, too, may well have pleased the naturalist John Ruskin. Far above Cayuga's waters, with its waves of blue, stands our noble alma mater, glorious to view.